Okay, let's go ahead and begin. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in today's session. My name is Jennifer Knievel, and I'll be moderating this session. I'm very pleased to welcome Jim Neal for his session, Employee Turnover, Exit Interviews, and Diversity, Equity, Access, and Inclusion. Jim is the University Librarian Emeritus at Columbia University and has worked in library administrative roles since 1973. He's past president and treasurer of ALA, past president of LAMA, and remains very active in the profession. Just a couple of quick reminders for everyone. This session is being recorded and will be available for later viewing after the conference. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature down in your bottom bar, and Jim will address questions at the end of the session. Please use the chat for any general comments or technical issues. And please make sure to set your chat to panelists and attendees if you want everyone to be able to see your comment. And also, please be sure to abide by the code of conduct, and I will place a link to the code of conduct in the chat. And that includes also a reporting form if you would like to use that. So with no further ado, I will turn this over to Jim.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm really honored to participate in this inaugural conference on academic library management, and thank you for attending this program. There are several things I want to say before I proceed. First, my pronouns are he, him. I really want to commend the conference organizers for producing such an effective multi-day event with excellent speakers and very useful discussions. Third, I want to thank Jennifer, Billy, and Rebecca for teaming with me to enable this presentation. Fourth, I think it's very important to understand the history that has brought us to our land. We must acknowledge, support, and celebrate Indigenous communities, but we must also acknowledge the horrors of ethnic cleansing, stolen land, and forced removal. I speak today from York, Pennsylvania, the acknowledged land of the Susquehannock and Conestoga people. They experienced great population loss in the 1670s due to disease and war and massacres due to the European colonists. These are horrendous crimes. Fifth, I want to read a statement that I included with my proposal to the conference organizers. I am a white, retired, male, academic library administrator. I recognize that this has been a highly represented group in library management for a long time, and that my identity carries with it significant privileges. I bring this recognition to my treatment of my topic today. It also draws from my years of involvement as an anti-racist and as an ally and mentor for colleagues of color, and my challenges to organizations and to myself to constantly assess and advance commitment and action for racial and social justice. Black Lives Matter. Attacks on Asian Americans are despicable and must stop. Last, because of my crazy health issues over the past month, I was not able to design colorful and visually interesting slides. I have text slides, but I hope you will find them information that is interesting and useful. My topic today is employee turnover, exit interviews, and diversity, access, and inclusion. My objectives are to encourage libraries and our larger professional community to implement effective turnover analysis and exit interview programs at the institutional and profession-wide levels, and to use these studies to understand and support diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, and to document in particular why staff of color enter, stay, and leave our libraries and librarianship. There have been some studies in academic libraries about turnover, but there have been very few studies. It tells us a lot about our libraries and librarianship. Turnover is an important measure of the vitality of an organization and of a profession. It tells us a lot about our field. Very few studies leads to a lack of information to help us plan and act accordingly. Workforce planning is not effective in the absence of understanding the turnover process and turnover trends. We have some work to do in this area in our libraries and in our field. There are lots of definitions of turnover. This is one that I particularly like. The degree of individual movement across the membership boundaries of an organization, the termination of employees, and the hiring of new staff to replace them. There are basically two types of turnover: voluntary, I choose to leave, or involuntary, I am forced to leave. That is very much from the employee perspective. There's also what we call avoidable versus unavoidable separations. And this is very much from the employer perspective. Intervention was an option. I could have made a difference, but the employee left. But there are unavoidable situations like death, retirement, budget reductions. And it's important, I think, in turnover management to understand those differences. We all, I think, have linkages with the organizations in which we work and which we belong to. There's that sense of membership status. Are we joining? Are we leaving? Or are we staying? There's also the quality of membership. What is the level of involvement and contributions that we're making to that organization? These, to me, are really binders that define what we feel and how we act as a member of an organization. It's in many ways a contract. It's an exchange relationship. We all trade something in return for receiving something back of value. There's lots of societal and professional trends that affect the type of bonds and the depth of those bonds. Economic conditions, obviously, the pandemic, technological change, increasing specialization in the jobs in libraries. There are many things that are going on in the wider world that influence turnover decisions and turnover trends. Many ways, a key element in understanding turnover is organizational commitment. There are many aspects of organizational commitment, but these are three that I think are particularly important. A strong belief in and acceptance of the organizational values and goals. Do we support the priorities and direction of the organization? Do we support the priorities and direction of the profession? Do we have a willingness to exert considerable effort on behalf of the organization? Does it make a difference to us if we stay? Are we willing to work hard to advance that organization's priorities and goals? And do we have a desire to maintain membership in that organization? Are we interested in staying or leaving the organization or the profession? Can my abilities be used and can my needs be satisfied? These, I think, are important questions in that organizational employee relationship. A very interesting area of study is the link between organizational commitment and professional commitment. There have been several studies in the literature that have tried to demonstrate that individuals who have a much more passionate professional commitment tend to have lower organizational commitment. It'll be interesting, I think, at some point to understand that in the context of libraries and librarianship. Turnover has an important impact on the organization and on the larger profession. There are positive aspects of turnover. It's not just a negative phenomena. It brings new talent and new ideas into the organization. There are certain jobs in our organization where turnover is sometimes inevitable or necessary because of the nature of the work. Turnover provides the opportunities for upward mobility. It allows us to increase our position in the field, to increase our earnings. From an employment aspect or perspective, there is this ability to bring underrepresented groups into the organization, to use vacancies on our staff. This is particularly important for advancing our diversity and access goals. It optimizes on a global level the fit between the individual, the skills that are needed, and the rewards that are available. But ultimately, turnover has its liabilities. There are costs, replacement costs. Turnover is expensive. It does lead to projects and work being impacted negatively and disruptive. And it does have an influence on the morale in the organization and the morale in the profession. It does influence how we look at the field, its culture, and its future. In many ways, it's a process. On the left, you have the personal issue of job satisfaction. You have a sense of how old I am and what tenure I have with that organization, and what is the probability that I have of finding an alternative position somewhere else. So we go through a process. Sometimes we think of quitting. Sometimes we ultimately get to a point where we intend to search. Then we ultimately intend to quit or stay. We start interviewing for other jobs. And when we're offered that other position, we quit or we stay. This is true also, I think, on the larger professional level, where I think we make that same type of assessment, and that turnover process, I think, applies in that environment as well. There are lots of tools in the literature for measuring the levels and patterns of turnover, both in the library and in the larger profession. These are two that I particularly favor. I think they're very useful in the organization and in the larger field. One is the crew turnover rate. It measures the volume of turnover, how much is taking place. It's easy to compute. Over a period of time, you take the average number of employees, you divide the number of departures, and you have a crewed turnover rate. Another very interesting measure is what is called average length of service leavers. It tells us where, in terms of tenure in the organization, that turnover is taking place. There's also stability and instability rates, where we may look at a cohort of employees who enter an organization over a period of time and measure how they leave or stay. There are other measures called survival and departure rates. I think that every organization should have some commitment and understanding of the patterns of turnover that are taking place. I think we, as a library community, have a responsibility to understand the patterns of change that are taking place within those who are part of our field as well. I'd like to pose a question, and I want you to, in the chat, respond easily, either yes or no or question mark. And we'll report back to you in a few minutes what the results of this survey is. The question I'm asking you to answer is, how many of your libraries have employee turnover collection and analysis programs? How many of you know whether your library, your organization collects these data and analyzes them and uses them to improve the organization? So please go into chat and put in yes, no, or question mark. There are different ways to determine turnover. Obviously, employee dissatisfaction and compensation can be overriding considerations, but there are also individual employee characteristics. We know from the research that younger employees tend to turn over more quickly than older employees. There are work-related factors. Is the work interesting? Are there strong organizational relationships? Is the communication in the organization effective? Are there opportunities for upward mobility? Are there problems with supervision? Economic variables also are key. During periods of high levels of employment, when we're not going through economic crises, there tends to be a higher level of turnover. People can find jobs. Obviously, there are issues around social change. We've also can look at the history of technology changes and their impact on turnover in libraries. In the 60s, when we moved to online circulation and shared cataloging, when we introduced library management systems, when we introduced digital content, and all the extraordinary technological changes that are taking place in libraries today, they shift the professional context. And sometimes they lead to turnovers of individuals who may not want to work in those environments, or who feel their organization is not stepping up to these technological changes and want to move to organizations that provide them. Rebecca, can you report out the results on that turnover question that I just posed?
Yes, so we're seeing an overwhelming preponderance of no. I saw only one yes and a couple of questions.
That to me is a great disappointment, and I hope that one of the motivations from this talk will be for you to encourage your library to consider, or your larger organization, city, county, to consider a more formal program of turnover to enable you to document the changes that are taking place and take appropriate actions in your organization to correct them. I want to digress a little bit and talk a little bit about organization. I think that this is a very influential aspect for institutional culture and employee dynamics. Clearly, individuals and groups work together to achieve the objectives that we've set within our organizations. We do this within a formal social and political structure, and we have established policies and processes that govern that organization. Organization is important because it tells us how goals and priorities are established, where decisions are being made, how resources are being allocated, who wields the power, how the plans are accomplished. Again, I don't think we give enough attention in libraries to our organizations. I think we live, excuse me one second. Okay. In my experience, organizations have different characteristics. And I think historically, so much of our libraries, organizations were defined by the characteristics on the left. My experience is as we move our organizational characteristics more to those elements on the right, we produce a healthier organization, and one which is characterized, I think, by a less inclination for people who want to leave, because there's more opportunities for participation, there's better supervision, there's better involvement in the decision process. So I ask you to look at those and think about your organization and whether decentralization, distribution, appropriate adhocracy, simplicity, informality, entrepreneurship, and collaboration are increasingly defining the work of your library. I think this has a significant impact on the turnover process and the turnover trends in our library organizations. I think, however, we pretend sometimes that our library organizations are actually working. I call these the current lie, that we actually distribute and share administrative responsibility and authority. I don't know if that happens in many organizations, that the operations and procedures are integrated and flexible, and we've learned how to eliminate the silos in our organization, that the policies and norms are consistently applied, and that there's a fluidity and vitality that helps produce productivity and success. I think we're making progress in libraries to set aside some of these lies and improve the quality of our organizational structures. Historically, our organizations have been very much structured with hierarchies and bureaucracies. It is what I call conventional and consultative governance. I see more and more of our library organizations migrating to the retention of some central administrative units that help with the planning and the resource allocation, but create what I call loosely coupled structures, organizations and units, departments, if you will, that have participated in and are committed to the goals and priorities of the organization and carry out their work to advance those goals and priorities. I also think in organizations going forward, and where I find young professionals really interested and satisfied, is where we can create opportunities, what I call maverick units and entrepreneurial enterprises, where there's less management, less control, and more freedom and innovation to try out new ideas and new approaches. I believe this lower level structure that I've described is actually healthier for turnover in the work of our libraries. We're really redefining the infrastructure of our libraries, the physical infrastructures, the expertise, the intellectual infrastructure, the where, the who, the why, the geography, the psychology, and the economics of innovation. I think these are very important trends in our libraries, and ones which I think are going to be very influential to attracting people to our organization, but also retaining people to work in our organization. We've all noted, I think, some important changes in library staffing. We are bringing in people into our libraries with diverse academic backgrounds. We are obviously continuing to hire people with accredited MLS degrees, but I think we're also hiring more and more people with other professional expertise and other academic backgrounds. This has led to not only a wide range of new professional assignments, but new people who are coming from different backgrounds, different academic backgrounds, different work backgrounds, and I think it creates a much healthier organization. We're also seeing new roles for support staff, administrative staff, and students who work in our organization. I've observed over time that many of the things that we as librarians did many years ago, in fact, are being carried out by different types of staff. And I'm seeing, to our benefit, a little bit more focus on what I call messy and fluid organizational structures. To me, these are very positive developments, and I think encourage particularly younger employees to come to our organizations and stay in our organizations. This has an impact on the values and outlooks and styles. I think it has an influence on how the campuses in which we work understand, recognize, and respect our work. And I think it also has an impact on organizational relevance and impact. What we do, I think, is seen as more important as more of our staff is diversified in the ways that I've described. I'd like now to turn attention to another important element of turnover management, which is the exit interview. I think this is essential. I think it has very important roles within the organization. And first of all, I think exit interviews are critical for discovery. They help us to understand why an individual is leaving a position or perhaps leaving the profession. It helps us to understand the employee experience working in the organization or the profession. It helps us communicate with that employee. It helps us take the results of those exit interviews and to share it with management or with the key organizations in the profession. Why are people leaving? What can we do to improve the work environment, the organizational culture, to retain the people who work in our organization? And ultimately, it leads to action, that is changing the organizational practices, policies, priorities, and culture. This is so much more challenging, I think, at the professional level. I think within a library organization, we can, in fact, create a robust and effective exit interview program. I think what we've learned is that is harder to do at the professional level. I think for any exit interview to be effective, we need to have clear assignments of responsibility for conducting the interview. Very often that's in the hands of a personnel professional. There needs to be an appropriate climate. I think it's most effective if it's in a private setting. It needs to be structured and standard. Obviously, a conversation with an employee or with a member of the profession will take the conversation in a certain direction. That is why sometimes, rather than interviews, surveys are used as part of exit interviews. We have to decide whether they're going to be optional or mandatory. It needs to be a confidential exchange. The responses need to be anonymous. And when the information is packaged from exit interviews and moved out to management and supervisors, individuals should not and cannot be identified. There needs to be clarity in the organization on how that information will be shared and used. These characteristics of exit interviews, I think, are really, really important for an effective exit interview program. So I'd like to pose question number 2. Does your library, to your knowledge, have a formal exit interview program for employees who have left? I wish you would indicate in chat either yes, no, or question mark. Let's see how many organizations, in fact, are doing this. So exit interviews have that diagnostic function. It helps us improve the organization. It helps us support employees as they leave the organization. There is that importance of separation assistance. Will we provide references? How can you get your last check? how do you manage and continue your benefits? But most importantly, these exit interviews are really important ways to determine the reasons people leave the organization. Why do people leave? That's the most important question. It's also an opportunity to clarify the complaints that the departing employee may have about the organization, or perhaps why they're being released. As I noted, it's a way to share information about the benefits, the continuation of benefits. You want to create a positive relationship with former employees because people will ask them, is that a good place to work? There is discussion of policies on references, as I noted, and it's ultimately a way to identify problem areas that require corrective actions in the management and supervision in the organization. We want to understand those management practices. We want to understand how people feel about their placement within the organization. Did they receive the training and development they needed to do their work effectively? Very often, the issue which is driving turnover is the compensation and benefits. I think we're also seeing over the past year some increasing concern and turnover attributed to health and safety, the degree which the organization, the library, owns the health and safety of its employees. People are concerned about job security. If they don't have a contract or if they don't have confidence that they're going to continue on a year-to-year basis. It's really also a way to look at supervisor-employee relations. Are they working? Does it open up opportunities for supervisor training that might be needed? But also there's the issue of employee relations. How did you feel about working in this organization? Did you have friends? Did you have colleagues and coworkers that you felt positive about? I think all of these target areas are essential aspects of an exit interview program. I have been monitoring exit interview results in academic libraries of all types in the United States over many years. Here are the things that I have learned. Why are people leaving? We are able, I think, to extrapolate these responses, these results on departures to the larger profession as well. Rebecca, what are the results of the exit interview question? What did we learn?
So on this one, we had about equal responses, no and question mark, and about half as many yeses as either of those. Okay,
so more libraries are in fact have organized exit interview programs as opposed to more formal turnover data collection and analysis. What do we hear from library workers when they leave their jobs? Well, an obvious one is that they are moving to a better opportunity elsewhere. Sometimes they feel a lack of job challenge. Some cases they feel they have not been treated fairly or have been not treated on an equal basis with others. Too often we hear about concerns about poor supervision. They didn't fit in. They don't have strong interpersonal relationships. Compensation, including both salary and benefits. I don't have the appropriate training. I'm not able to do my job well. I'm following a graduating spouse or partner. I'm returning to school to get another degree. We also learned that sometimes we hire people for the wrong jobs. We don't provide effective grievance procedures so that people who have concerns and issues can bring those to the attention of supervision and management. And we have not provided them with the training they need to do their job well. These are the types of issues that typically have come up in academic libraries as we look at exit interview data. I'd like to turn now to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. I believe that we must focus more of our turnover and exit interview processes and analysis in these areas. We need to understand why people of color, why individuals who have handicaps are coming to work in organizations, what their experiences have been, and why they're leaving work in our organizations. And as we've learned through data we've collected on a national level, why we have not seen improvements in the number of individuals of color who are working in organizations. So I've drawn some definitions from the work of the American Library Association, and I'm simply going to read these because I think these are very helpful to keep in our mind as we think about diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. On a very simple level, diversity is the sum of the ways that people are alike and different. And I think that's clearly a culture that we want to create in our libraries. Equity embraces the differences to ensure a fair process and a fair outcome. Inclusion, the environment in which individuals are treated fairly and respectfully, are valued for their distinctive skills, experiences, and perspectives, have equal access to resources and opportunities, and can contribute to the organization's success. How many of our libraries would be characterized as having a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? I brought access into this because I think that's something which is often not embraced as we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion within our organizations. Access for me is creating products, services, and working environments that are usable by individuals with the widest possible range of abilities, operating within the widest range of situations. We have a responsibility under law in our country and in our states to accommodate individuals and to make accessibility a core value of working within our organizations. I believe that we should spend more time in our turnover analysis in our exit interview programs understanding not only how people of color, not only how handicapped individuals, but how all people within the organization understand and view diversity, equity, access, and inclusion in the culture, in the work, and in the success of the organization. I believe we can learn a lot if we did more work with turnover and exit interviews and posed questions and explored issues in these areas. As I mentioned earlier, we have a much harder time understanding these issues at the profession level. We know, based on studies we have done over the last 20 to 25 years, that in spite of setting it as a priority, and putting together important programs to recruit and retain individuals of color in the work of libraries, academic libraries, we have not made significant progress. And we know that we have really issues around racial and social justice in many of our institutions. I want to cite a work in progress. This is a study that Martin Garner at Amherst College is carrying out as his dissertation research. He is using a narrative inquiry to pose these 4 questions to individuals who have left the profession of librarianship. He wants to find out what their experience was as an academic librarian of color. How did that experience contribute to whether or not they remained in the profession? What were the retention efforts that were made to keep them in the work of libraries and in the profession? And were those successful? What were the most successful activities? And according to academic librarians of color, what elements of structural racism are present within the fields of academic librarianship? He's posed in his research definition these 4 questions that he's going to explore with the community of academic librarians of color that he's going to speak with as part of his dissertation research. I think this is a fundamentally important study, and I think we all will look very forward to the results of his project. So I want to conclude by arguing that we must incorporate diversity, equity, access, and inclusion into the turnover analysis process. Where is turnover taking place? I think it's equally important to integrate diversity, access, and inclusion into our exit interview process. And let me say, if you don't have a turnover analysis process, if you don't have an exit interview process, I think it's important to advocate for those within your library. And as we will, I think, at the professional level as well. We need to understand not just where turnover is taking place, but what has been that employee experience. I've encouraged the use of what I call stay interviews exit interviews are common and are used when employees leave, but we don't often intervene and talk to employees who stay to understand what is good within the organization, or what are the barriers to departure that they are facing. So I encourage organizations not only to look at exit interviews, but also stay interviews. I also think it's very important to expand these management strategies, that is turnover analysis and exit interviews, to profession-wide research and action. And I think Martin Garner's study is a very important step in that direction. So what I tried to do today was to help to expand understanding of what employee turnover is and why it's important, and to a small extent what we've learned, in that we don't have a lot of studies on turnover within our field at the institutional and certainly not at the professional level. I wanted to demonstrate that our organizational trends, organizational cultures, organizational characteristics can be very important in understanding staff dynamics within an organization and out of an organization. I wanted to encourage a better understanding of exit interviews as a way to understand why employees leave and stay, and what we as managers and supervisors can do to create a better work experience, organizational experience, a success experience for the employees in our library. And I wanted to encourage everyone to extend these practices and these studies and analysis to our strong commitment within our libraries and within our fields to understand the critical centrality of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. The last thing I wanted to ask, a final question I wanted to ask, and again, I asked in chat if you would say yes, no, or question mark. To your knowledge, how many of your libraries have formal diversity, equity, access, and inclusion programs? Please, if you would just quickly type yes, no, question mark. I know a lot of libraries have participated at the college or university level and are operating under those umbrellas, but I always find it most effective when libraries are willing and able to bring employees together and to advance organizationally at the library level a commitment to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. What do we have as the results of that question?
So we have roughly 3 times more yeses than nos on this one.
Well, that's very positive. It demonstrates to me that libraries have embraced this as a priority. And what I'm hoping that now you'll take away is how we can extend turnover understanding and exit interview processes to get a better handle on why employees come, why they stay, and why they leave. So that completes my presentation, and I'll be very interested in your questions and your comments.
Okay. And I think the question that we've first got is, can you recommend strategies to convince resistant administrators of the value and need for exit interviews? So often I hear negative feedback written off as sour grapes.
Well, I think the several slides that I presented to you demonstrate that this is not just sour grapes, that there's important information to be gleaned from these exit interviews that can be used to help improve supervision and management in the organization. I think it's also critical to understand that not everyone who leaves an organization is unhappy, and not every unhappy person leaves an organization. I think we all know that. And I think if people are moving on because of factors or characteristics that they can't control, and they feel positive about their work experience, that can be a very useful exit interview as well. Understanding what works in the organization. I think it has its pluses and minuses, its liabilities and its assets, but I think it's a disservice to the library, and it's a service to the current employees and the departing employees not to ask them standardized anonymous questions as they leave the organization. I think the only way we're going to improve the work environment and improve the conditions for employment in our libraries is to understand why employees leave, why employees stay, what worked and what didn't work. And so maybe you can use some of the slides that I shared as a way to influence some of the thinking of the management in your library.
And we have a couple of questions that kind of align. Can we see examples of questions you've used in a stay interview? And can you talk a little bit more about what those would look like?
Yes, so individuals who stay, I think some of the same questions you would use in an exit interview is, what do you like about this organization? What works for you? Are we providing adequate training and support? Do you see opportunities that you want to advance in your career? How can we provide better support for you in your professional development work? I think it's more affirmative. It's understanding how an employee feels, why they're staying. Some negatives will come out in those stay interviews. I wish my salary was higher. I wish there was better supervision within my unit. But I think it's sort of preliminary to the exit. It gives the opportunity to intervene earlier before an employee decides to leave. So I think many of the questions that are not specific to departure, but are linked to how an employee feels about working in that organization can be extrapolated into a stay interview. That's been my experience. They're not unlike each other, but some of the content will be different. Some of the content will be the same.
And perhaps related, where would you suggest a library start in creating questions for the exit interview?
There's a strong literature on exit interviews. I think I did a paper a number of years ago on the exit interview in the library, and there's some content there that might be helpful. There actually is a huge literature out of the corporate environment. Obviously, it's different. We work in a different setting with different cultures and different goals and objectives. But I think some of those questions are very useful, and I would encourage you to take a look at that literature. It also, if you're in an academic community, it might be useful to go to other units within the college or university to ask if they do exit interviews and if they would share information about what they ask and how effective it's been. I think central HR, the university or college human resources department, probably has some useful questions that might be employed. But I think it's also important to understand what you want to know. So it's not just sort of generic questions, which I think have a place in exit interviews, but are there particular issues or questions that you want to explore because of developments in your library? We've implemented this massive change in our technology. How has that worked for you? Has it been a problem? Did you get adequate training and support? We are working from home over the past year. Can you help us understand, did we provide enough support? Did we take care of your health risks adequately? So I think there are generic questions, general questions, but I think there might also be very specific questions to the setting, your library, or to the time that you're asking these questions.
I also got a question here. What role do you think onboarding programs and/or mentoring programs have in reducing high turnover?
I think they're critically important. I think onboarding, a lot of libraries tend to think about onboarding as training. They don't see the importance of building supervisor-employee relationships, employee-to-employee relationships, helping employees understand the priorities and goals of the organization, making sure there's a clear understanding of what skills and expertise and experience they're bringing into the organization, where there might be gaps that exist. That issue of the skills and expertise they're bringing in, we don't always glean those from the interview process. So I find the onboarding can be a very valuable opportunity to understand a little bit more detail and depth about where a person has been and what real strengths they have to contribute to the work of the organization. I've done a number of presentations over the years on mentoring. Mentoring in most settings fail because there's not an organizational commitment. There's not a commitment of time and understanding and expertise to that work. I think mentoring is very, very valuable. I've been a mentor over the years to about 20 new professionals, as well as professionals of color. And I found that I needed to learn and listen and benefit from those relationships in the same way that I hoped that the person I was working with would learn and benefit as well. So it's a sharing. And the degree to which it's seen as I'm passing my expertise and my experience on to you, that's not going to lead to an effective mentorship. So I think if it's seen as a two-way learning experience and that there's a commitment and a set aside of time to meet and talk regularly, to make it a supportive environment, to make it an anonymous environment, and to provide constant follow-up and feedback both ways, I think can help make for an effective mentoring relationship. I worry about mentoring programs because very often there's not organizational commitment to those programs. I think it very much depends on the commitment of the individuals and the willingness of the organization to support those individuals in terms of time and participation.
And do you have recommendations of authors whose work has been engaging to you in these areas?
I did a paper on turnover a number of years ago. I'm going to stand up for a second and go get the paper. Hold on. The paper was called The Turnover Process and the Academic Library. And I published it actually early 1984. And I cite it only because it cites what I call the classical literature, the important thinking that's gone on over a 50-year period on turnover. I found that to be very influential and helpful. I'm going to stand up one more time and get another article. The other article that I will cite, I published in 1989, called Employee Turnover and the Exit Interview. That also includes in the bibliography and the references, I think, some of the classic work on exit interviews. Actually, there was a very good article published last year in the Journal of Library Administration that brings up to date, I think, some of the references that I included in my earlier paper. This is not my paper. It's called Contributory Factors to Academic Librarian Turnover. It's authored by 5 individuals, but you'll find it in the Journal of Library Administration, volume 60, number 6. And I found it to be a very useful study, a very thorough and rigorous study. But I think in terms of your question, it does cite some of the important current literature, both from the organizational literature and from the library literature that may be of interest to you. There are some really important researchers in this field, and I think those 3 papers will give you some guidance.
Okay. And you mentioned a level of turnover is unavoidable or even beneficial. Is there such a thing as a normal turnover rate?
No, I don't think there is a normal turnover rate. I think one needs to understand the turnover rate in the context of your organization, that is university, college, the turnover rate in your community, the city or town in which you live, the turnover rates that are being experienced at that time by peer institutions around the region or the country. The challenge is we don't systematically gather these data and we don't share these data, which is something I think it's important for us to do. You will know in an organization whether the turnover rate is too low, that is, you're not bringing in fresh ideas, fresh experience and expertise, or too many people are leaving and it's having an impact on the work and the projects and priorities of the organization. So I would say there's no standard. They try to argue for some of those standards in the literature that if you go into it, you'll see, but I don't think those are very good benchmarks for understanding what works and what doesn't work. I think we need more peer data. to understand our library community situation. But I think within a college or university, or within a region, within a state, I think can be also very valuable benchmarks on which to measure turnover in your own library.
And then we have a question. What do you do as an employee when the organization doesn't care about their relationship with you, doesn't protect your safety, and your only option is to leave the organization?
Well, that's a tough question. It's a question I often get. And I think as I said, not all employees who leave are dissatisfied, and not all dissatisfied employees leave. It's unfortunate that in this day and age, we continue to have library administrators, managers, and supervisors who don't understand the importance of supporting their employees, providing positive work environments, providing opportunities for growth, for professional development. I think that HR departments can be helpful in some cases. I know that that's always a risk to take. I think hopefully there will be, if there are exit interviews, some of these patterns will come out in the anonymous, honest feedback that departing employees provide. But when individuals have brought to me their concerns, if they feel that they have the ability to relocate, that the economic conditions in the field are opening up opportunities for moving, if there are jobs which attract their interest, if their family is able to make that move, if it offers opportunities to improve their salary, their compensation, their personal situations, then I encourage them to leave, to look at other opportunities. Obviously, the ability to look at a national pool of vacancies as opposed to a local pool of vacancies makes it much different in terms of the ability to move. But I hear you, and I think it's unfortunate that we have to deal with those situations. The degree to which we can bring to the attention of those administrators the difficulties they're creating and the negative work environment that they are producing, I think we need to find ways to do that better. I'm sorry that you face that.
Right, and the next question is, regarding exit surveys interviews, what are your thoughts on doing these retroactively?
I think in many organizations, the timing is important. In my own experience, exit interviews are best dealt with before the employee leaves, because very often it's hard to get them, particularly if they've moved out of the area. In many organizations, the exit survey, the questionnaire, can be administered before they leave, and very often it's administered after they leave. It's sometimes now being done as an anonymous survey online, and that I think can be useful. I don't know if I wouldn't wait too long. Obviously, you want the employee to feel a commitment to provide information back to the organization. And you want them not to blow it off. You want them to take an interest in providing that information back to the organization. So I think from an organizational perspective, interviews before they leave, surveys before or after, but not taking too long. It's always important to remember that those be professionally administered, that they be anonymous, that individuals feel safe in providing that information. And when the information is received, it needs to be packaged so that an individual who's conducting the interview or receiving the information doesn't run to a supervisor or manager and say, do you know what so-and-so said as they left the organization? I think that will pollute the organization and make people unwilling to provide honest feedback in an exit interview or survey. So packaging that information after a period of exit interviews, I think, is critically important. Sometimes organizations are too small, the libraries are too small, and these exit interviews programs need to be conducted at the college or university level, and then feedback provided back into the library.
Okay, well, that was the last question we have in the Q&A
Thank
right
you,
now.
everyone. Those were really good questions, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to share some information with you today. I hope the presentation was useful. My email address is jneal0@columbia.edu. And if there's anything I can do, if you have any questions, any follow-up, anything you want to share, any questions that you might have, any help I can provide, please be in touch with me. I respond to everyone all the time, and I want to be as helpful and provide feedback as I can. So thanks again. And again, this has been a really great conference.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that great session and for answering our questions. Before I close the session, I did just put a link to the evaluation form in the chat, so please take just a minute to fill it out. It's quite short. And we will see you all again tomorrow. Thank you.